Next up, continuing the Star Trek panel, is Eric Muirhead. Eric is an instructor of history at the United States Military Academy. He's the acting East Asian History Program Director and teaches Asian Warfare and Politics, Intro to East Asian History, and Army of the Republic, Leading Citizen Soldiers. Major Muirhead's an armor officer with operational deployments to Afghanistan and the Republic of Korea. His experience includes mechanized infantry and scout platoon leader, troop executive officer, squadron logistical officer, and a whole bunch of others up to the headquarters troop commander level. He holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from the College of William and Mary in Virginia and a master's in history from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. His research focuses World War II with an emphasis on German and Japanese military culture, and unfortunately, the Army has repeatedly denied his request to participate in the officer exchange program with the Klingon Empire. All right, Eric, you're up, and hopefully this presentation gets you into the exchange program.
Good evening. Pavej nablahoch ach kateldoch nablahoch napush, or everything is very simple in war, but the simplest thing is difficult. Clausewitz is always better in the original Klingon. The Dominion War of 2373 to 2375 was a crucible that showcased the greatest strengths and weaknesses of the galaxy's most formidable powers. In engagements from the liberation of Deep Space Nine to the Chintaka campaigns, fast, mobile, and versatile Klingon strike fleets proved decisive in breaking through Dominion lines and exploiting gains through the effective use of amphibious infantry. The Klingon Defense Force has always structured itself to project and support rapidly deployable, self-sustaining joint units composed of both ground and naval forces that fight together across the full spectrum of environments. Starfleet must adopt the expeditionary mindset of its closest ally in order to stay relevant and meet the rapidly changing challenges of a post-Dominion War galaxy. The 2293 Khitomer Accords drastically increased the amount of resources available to Starfleet for peaceful exploration, diplomatic, and scientific missions. Beginning with the Block II Excelsior class in the early 2290s, Federation starships' gross tonnage grew larger to accommodate the greater fuel capacity, provisions, and scientific equipment necessary for longer and more complex deep space missions. Crew complement also drastically increased to support specialized laboratories, diplomatic conferences, and execute more complex first contact missions further away from Sector 001. By the 2340s, the Excelsior was eclipsed as the most advanced vessel in the fleet by the Ambassador class, a ship whose speed, size, made it the living embodiment of Federation foreign policy at the midpoint of the 24th century. However, these large multi-role vessels created a paradox. As Starfleet ships became more capable of supporting more complex missions, they were expected to conduct even more complex missions. The durations of these continuing voyages became so long that Starfleet Command made the decision to allow families aboard, creating an even greater need for on-ship recreational, medical, and child development facilities. The pinnacle of these lines of effort was the Galaxy class of the 2360s, a monster at over 641 meters in length and 42 decks in height, with living quarters and support facilities for 1,012 personnel and their families. Though the Battle of Wolf 359 in 2367 drastically reduced the number of civilians carried on starships, the Sovereign class of the 2370s was even longer at almost 700 meters in length and 24 decks in height. These heavy exploration cruisers became the centerpieces of Starfleet's space supremacy strategy, but were extraordinarily resource-intensive to construct and maintain. Starfleet did develop smaller escorts, such as the Akira, Steamrunner, and Defiant classes, but not to relieve burden on their larger sisters. Rather, their role was to protect the heavier, more expensive capital ships, which Starfleet saw as their critical pacing items in any extended military scenario. Conversely, after the economic devastation of the Praxis disaster in 2293, the Klingon Empire needed to safeguard its territory as efficiently as possible. The KDF under Chancellor Azet Bur developed a two-pronged strategy. First, it would extend the service life of its existing starships to an extreme degree. Some Burrell-class birds of prey and Katinga-class battlecruisers would, in fact, see 7 decades of active duty. However, the second half of the efficiency strategy was firmly rooted in Klingon cultural norms. The warrior caste ruled the empire, and all other citizens and tributaries, regardless of gender, class, or species, had to, at least tacitly, support the military government to maintain political and social agency. Since Kahless the Unforgettable ruled Kronos in Earth's 9th century, Klingons have viewed close, hand-to-hand battle as the apex of honorable combat. Unlike Starfleet, which tends to use technology to create physical and moral distance between itself and raw violence, the KDF has always placed its greatest emphasis on supporting individual warriors in close combat. Using advanced ship construction techniques acquired after the Treaty of Alliance in 2352, the Klingons developed a new class of warship that would form the heart of their new deep space strategy. It too would be a multi-purpose heavy cruiser, but unlike Starfleet's ships, every function of the new Vokcha-class attack cruiser would support one goal: the deployment and sustainment of a Klingon Marine Expeditionary Force. This would drastically simplify the Klingon fleet, reducing the need for specialized fire support ships, troop transports, and supply vessels. The name Vokcha comes from the combination of 2 Klingon words: Vokh, the verb meaning to project or to launch, and Cha, meaning torpedoes. As the ship's name implies, the vessel is literally an armored weapons platform. Combined with excellent warp and impulse drives, and with berthing space for over 900 Klingon Marines, their equipment, and landing craft, the Vokcha acts as a mobile, protected forward operating base that can secure itself, gain local space superiority, and deploy large numbers of Klingon forces to a planetary surface. It can then remain on station to support them for an extended period until relieved. With a Klingon spaceground task force at its heart, the Klingon strike fleet represents all the warfighting functions combined in an efficient expeditionary team. While 24th century Federation naval architects concerned themselves with creating all the comforts of home for extended multi-domain missions, Klingon ship designers focused on creating practical vessels, which encouraged their crews to remain focused on readiness, a deployment mindset in which all personnel in a strike fleet remain cognizant of the ever-present possibility of battle. Sadly, no series of events demonstrates the disparity between Federation and Klingon military capabilities more than the brutal Chintaka campaign of 2374 to 2375. After the Romulan Star Empire entered the conflict on the side of the Federation alliance, Starfleet planners were anxious to conduct their first major offensive into Cardassian territory. A massive combined fleet of Federation, Klingon, and Romulan vessels embarked from Deep Space Nine and launched an attack on the Chintaka system. Though the Federation's heavy cruisers led the charge into the Dominion defenses, it was the Klingon strike fleets and their embarked Marine units which ultimately captured both habitable planets of the system. However, in the following weeks, the Federation strategy of pursuing absolute space supremacy rather than maintaining local space superiority had disastrous consequences for the UFP ground troops left behind on the outlying satellite moons. Federation naval forces departed to safe harbors to rebuild combat power, leaving their infantry units behind at the mercy of the Dominion Navy without any kind of orbital fire support or extended sustainment plan. One Federation soldier at AR-558 reported to Captain Sisko of the USS Defiant that despite Starfleet regulations mandating relief after 90 days on the front lines, he and his unit had been outnumbered and unsupported for well over 5 months. They ultimately saw half their numbers killed or severely wounded before Starfleet finally pulled them off the line. This incident and others represent a grossly negligent act by Starfleet planners who fail to understand that without joint support, ground forces simply cannot be expected to maintain their positions against determined resistance. This catastrophe stands in stark contrast to the resilience of Klingon forces during the same campaign. After the Second Battle of Chintaka in 2375, most of the Federation and Romulan fleets were sidelined by the Dominion deployment of energy-dampening weapons. Only Klingon ships were unaffected by this new technology. For 8 weeks, the Klingon Defense Force assumed all responsibility for maintaining Federation alliance positions with no outside help. Smaller ships were detached to conduct security and screening operations across the hundreds of light years, while larger ships conducted a defense in depth around centers of gravity to keep the Dominion Navy at bay and continue supporting their ground forces. Only the high levels of Klingon training and readiness, combined with the modular, self-sustaining organization of their strike fleets, averted defeat for the entire Alpha Quadrant. To Klingons, winning matters. However, Klingons also understand that the brute strength of one's fleets or firepower is not always the key to victory. Rather, the Klingon way of war is exemplified by the old proverb, Medach jadi shuvwi jupu dash lombe, or when a warrior goes into battle, he does not abandon his friends. The secret of victory lies in cohesive, joint, and integrated units who are trained, equipped, and ready to fight any battle, anywhere. The expeditionary mindset. The Alpha and Beta quadrants have only grown more complex since the surrender of the Dominion, with resurgent Romulan aggression, cyber terrorism, and peacekeeping operations in the former Cardassian Empire. Starfleet will face military challenges across the full spectrum of operations, from conventional combat to defense support of civil authorities. The only way that it will be able to meet those challenges is not with a new ship or a new weapon, but instead by looking to the Klingon model and strengthening its team. Thank you.